Good evening, I'm Amirul Aiman. Here are tonight's top stories. Tensions rise along the Thai-Cambodian border with at least 1% reported dead. And US Secretary of State Marco Rubio cautions that rising violence in the West Bank could undermine efforts to secure lasting peace in Gaza. All that and more coming up on AWANI International. Cambodia reports one civilian has been shot dead in fresh clashes along the border with Thailand. Prime Minister Hun Manet says 3 others were wounded in the fighting in the country's northwest. The violence comes after Thailand suspended the implementation of its peace deal with Cambodia on Monday, following a landmine blast that injured 4 Thai soldiers. In the latest incident, Bangkok accused Cambodian troops of firing shots into Thai territory. The Thai army said its personnel took cover and returned warning fire, with the exchange lasting about 10 minutes. 5 days of heavy clashes had broken out between both sides in July, killing 43 people and displacing more than 300,000 before the truce took effect. China has demanded Japan withdraw recent comments by Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi on Taiwan, calling them deeply inappropriate and warning Tokyo would bear the consequences if she refuses. The diplomatic spat began after Takaichi told Parliament that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could endanger Japan's security and might even justify a military response from Tokyo.
In Beijing, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian said Takaichi's remarks interfered in China's internal affairs and warned that any Japanese involvement in the Taiwan Strait would be treated as aggression. Tensions have shown no signs of easing this week. A social media account linked to China's state broadcaster CCTV labeled Takaichi a troublemaker, accusing her of reckless behavior. While in Tokyo, senior politicians have called for the expulsion of China's Consul General in Osaka, Sui Jian, over a threatening post criticizing Takaichi.
US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has expressed concern over rising violence by Israeli settlers in the West Bank, warning it could threaten the fragile ceasefire in Gaza. Speaking after a G7 foreign ministers meeting in Canada, Rubio said Washington is watching the situation closely, but does not expect it to derail current US-backed efforts in Gaza.
Certainly there's some concern about events in the West Bank spilling over and creating an effect that could undermine what we're doing in Gaza. We don't expect it to. We'll do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen.
Israeli defense officials say extremist settler attacks have surged in 2025. The IDF recorded 440 cases it described as nationalist crimes in the first half of the year, almost 40% more than the same period last year. One of the most serious recent incidents occurred in Beit Lit, where around 100 masked settlers raided a Palestinian factory, torched vehicles and clashed with soldiers. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and coalition officials have so far avoided commenting on the violence, prompting critics to accuse the government of quietly enabling the attacks. Stay with us, more updates coming your way right after the break.
Di dalam setiap berita yang dibawa, konteks amat penting. Kami sentiasa membawakan yang tergempar dan terkini. Pastikan Astro AWANI menjadi pilihan anda, tidak kira di mana sahaja anda berada.
Welcome back. The United States has ended its longest government shutdown in history after President Donald Trump signed a funding bill to reopen federal agencies following 43 days of closure. The House approved the measure Wednesday night, restoring pay for hundreds of thousands of federal workers and restarting key services, including food aid and air traffic operations.
The bill only funds the government through January 30th, leaving Congress with another deadline to avoid a new shutdown. Democrats had hoped to use the impasse to extend federal health insurance subsidies for 24 million Americans, but the deal makes no such provision. The end of the shutdown allows air travel operations to recover and restarts food assistance for millions. But some economic damage may be lasting longer. Critical labor and inflation reports for October may be lost, and economists say the shutdown shaved more than 1/10 of a percentage point off weekly GDP.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has defended Washington's controversial strikes on suspected drug vessels in the Caribbean, rejecting European criticism that the operations breach international law. Speaking after a G7 foreign ministers meeting in Canada, Rubio said Europe does not get to dictate how the U.S. protects its national security.
French Foreign Minister Jean-Noel Barrot warned that U.S. boat strikes threaten French territories in the Caribbean and breach international law. Rubio insisted the targets were narco-terrorists. Since early September, the Trump administration has carried out 19 strikes on small vessels in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, killing at least 76 people. U.S. officials say the victims were smugglers but have not released evidence verifying who was on the boats or what they were carrying. Rubio also dismissed reports that the UK had paused some intelligence sharing over legal concerns. Colombia, a key partner in fighting the drug trade, has halted intel cooperation, citing alleged human rights violations. The U.S. maintains its actions are allowed under Article 51 of the UN Charter, though independent UN experts have called the strikes extrajudicial executions. The G7 ministers, however, made no direct reference to the U.S. campaign in their joint statement, only reaffirming support for maritime security against drug trafficking.
A coalition led by Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani has come out on top in the country's parliamentary election. According to the Electoral Commission, al-Sudani's coalition secured 1.3 million votes, around 370,000 more than its nearest rival.
Speaking after the initial results, al-Sudani praised the 56% voter turnout on Tuesday's vote, calling it a sign of restored confidence in Iraq's political system. But the election was also marked by voter disillusionment. Many Iraqis saw it as little more than a contest for established parties to divide the country's oil wealth, despite al-Sudani's pitch as a leader who could steer Iraq towards stability after decades of turmoil. No single party can form a government in Iraq's 329-seat parliament. Parties must build alliances, a process that can take months, though early estimates suggest al-Sudani's coalition may have won around 50 seats. Under Iraq's power-sharing system, the premiership goes to a Shiite, the speakership to a Sunni, and the presidency to a Kurd. The next government will face strong pressure from Iraqis demanding jobs, better schools and improved healthcare amid widespread public frustration. Al-Sudani will also need to carefully balance relations with Iraq's key allies, Iran and the United States, in a region undergoing rapid changes.
French President Emmanuel Macron says the next major wars could begin in space. Speaking to military officials, he warned that modern conflicts are already unfolding beyond Earth's atmosphere and that space is no longer a sanctuary but a potential battlefield, citing growing threats from Russia.
Macron noted that Russia had engaged in espionage in space since its 2022 invasion of Ukraine, with Russian vehicles tracking French satellites. He also accused Moscow of widespread GPS jamming and cyber attacks targeting space infrastructure, warning that any attempt to deploy nuclear weapons in orbit would spark a global catastrophe. To bolster defences, Macron announced an extra 4.2 billion euros for military space operations through 2030. Macron had previously criticised Europe's space industry for struggling to compete with the US and China. He warned that readiness in space will ultimately decide success on land, in the air and at sea.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says he hopes the United States avoids any action that could escalate the war in Ukraine. He says he trusts that common sense in Washington prevents steps that might push the conflict to a new level, while praising US President Donald Trump for continuing to support dialogue with Moscow.
Lavrov added that Trump recognized Russia's long-standing concerns about NATO expansion and its military presence near Russian borders, issues Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned about for years. He went on to accuse European governments of blocking US efforts to reach a settlement, imposing sanctions that hurt their own economies and preparing for a wider confrontation with Russia. Lavrov said Moscow will only resume talks once, in his words, the irrational anti-Russian stance ends.
The search continues for Rohingya refugees lost at sea after yet another dangerous journey in search of safety. As the crisis deepens, pressure is mounting on the region to respond. Human rights advocate Debbie Stoddart, founder of Alternative ASEAN Network on Burma, is calling on ASEAN nations to take immediate action, warning the situation is growing increasingly dire and urgent.
Now, in recent years, what we've seen disturbingly is that more women and children are getting on the boats. Everyone knows that getting on a boat, for Rohingya people to get on a boat, and these are not exactly ships or very seaworthy vessels, to try and get to Malaysia and Indonesia, it is a very big risk. And there's a very high danger of dying at sea. But we saw that the situation in the refugee camps in Bangladesh, and more importantly, the situation in Arakan or Rakhine State, was getting so bad that women and children were taking the risk. So it was very difficult because in the camps in Bangladesh, the murder rate had already risen to 10 times the murder rate of Malaysia.
While ASEAN continues to push its 5-point consensus peace plan with Myanmar's junta, she warns the approach is deeply flawed as it continues to ignore the ongoing neglect and persecution of the Rohingya.
We also need to understand the Rohingya, the treatment of the Rohingya and the genocide of the Rohingya is really one of the starting points of the coup. The military was able to get away with the genocide, and therefore they had no problems start launching a coup and doing very similar atrocity crimes to other people in other areas, not just ethnic minorities, but also the Burman majority themselves were targeted with atrocity crimes. So I think, the 5-point consensus is problematic because it doesn't take into account the Rohingya, and it doesn't take into account the political prisoners in the country. And there's still at least 23,000 people currently being detained in Myanmar's jails as political prisoners.
Debbie calls on ASEAN to adopt an approach that centers on its responsibility to protect those fleeing persecution and conflict.
ASEAN needs to have a more practical approach, which recognizes and allows refugees in their territory to work. They need to recognize that they do have a responsibility to protect. When ASEAN talks about responsibility to protect, it doesn't mean sending peacekeepers to Myanmar. It just means, to start with, as a most basic responsibility to protect is to protect those fleeing genocide and atrocity crimes who are currently in your jurisdiction. Make sure they have access to civilian protection, make sure they have a chance to rebuild their lives and to contribute back to our broader community and our national economies. That's a very basic and practical approach. And also ASEAN needs to also understand they do have a collective responsibility to address the root causes that forced all these people to flee from their country.
That concludes AWANI International for tonight. Stay with us as we track the strategies and power shifts shaping the new global order. For more updates, visit international.astroawani.com and follow us on social media. I'm Amirul Aiman. Thank you for watching and good night.